This is Citations Needed with Nima Shirazi and Adam Johnson.
Welcome to Citations Needed, a podcast on the media, power, PR, and the history of bullshit. I am Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
You can follow the show on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook, Citations Needed, and become a supporter of the show through patreon.com/Citations Needed podcast. All your support through Patreon is so incredibly appreciated as we are 100% listener funded. We don't run ads. We don't read commercial copy. We don't have nonprofit or foundation funding. We are able to do this because of the support we get from amazing listeners like you.
Yes, if you listen to the show and you like it and you haven't yet, please do sign up for our Patreon. It helps keep the episodes themselves free and helps keep the show sustainable.
Teachers' unions, still a huge obstacle to reform. Countering Iran's menacing Persian Gulf Navy. Open everything. The time to end pandemic restrictions is now. The Good Republicans' last stand.
Each of these headlines comes from the same magazine, the Atlantic magazine. For 167 years, the publication has enjoyed elite stature in the American literary and journalistic world, publishing such luminaries as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Barack Obama, and serving as a coveted professional destination for writers throughout the country. Founded in part by a number of esteemed 19th century authors, the magazine has long prided itself on its cultural and political depth.
But beneath all of its high-minded rhetoric about democracy, free expression, fearlessness, and American ideals is a vehicle of center-right pablum, designed to launder reactionary opinions for a liberal-leaning audience. As the employer of warmongers like Jeffrey Goldberg, Applebaum, and David Frum, under the ownership of a Silicon Valley-tied investment firm hell-bent on destroying teachers' unions, the Atlantic magazine, time and again, proves a far cry from the truth-pursuing, consensus-disrupting outlet that it so often claims to be.
On today's episode, we'll provide a deep dive into the history and general ideology of the Atlantic magazine, examining its currents of middlebrow conservatism, left-punching, and deference to boring business owners that have run through the magazine throughout its nearly 17 decades in operation.
Later on the episode, we'll be joined by friend of the show, writer John Schwartz.
David Frum, Jeffrey Goldberg, a lot of these other people, makes you understand what their job actually is. So the naive might believe that the job of journalists is to try to find out the truth and tell other people about the truth. And if that were the case, obviously their careers would have been ended by their catastrophically wrong statements and claims before the war. So that would be if that were their job, to find out the truth. If their job was to start wars, then obviously they would be promoted, and we know what happened. And so that tells us a lot about what their jobs actually are.
This is a spiritual successor, TM, to a couple episodes, specifically our episode on The Economist magazine, The Refined Sociopathy of the Economist, from episode 98 from 2020. Anytime you do an episode on a single publication, it can be difficult for fairly obvious reasons, which is that publications oftentimes do have ideological diversity. So much of what we're discussing today is really the kind of broad outlines or the overwhelming ideological tilt, we should say. There are, of course, going to be exceptions to this.
Of course.
I believe we've had Atlantic writers even on the show, because some of them don't suck. And so there will be some generalizations. With that caveat, I think it's fair to say that these are quantifiable and objective determinations as to the ideological proclivities of this publication, because all publications have some ideological leanings. And this is also, in some ways, a spiritual successor to a fairly recent episode 195, David Leonhardt and the Elite Consensus Manufacturing Machine, where we talked about the fundamentally conservative ideology of the New York Times specifically.
So this is not to say that there haven't been wonderful things published in the New York Times, or that everyone who works or writes for the New York Times shares one single political bent or one kind of ideology. No. But as we have often discussed on this show, the New York Times itself is ideologically committed to certain things, as voiced time and again by its publishers and by its senior editors. It is committed to a worldview that promotes, say, capitalism on purpose. Maybe that's not weird in the American media industry, of course, but it definitely establishes a tone, a voice, a perspective institutionally. And that is the same as we've discussed as The Economist at other publications as well, and certainly for The Atlantic magazine. So let's start with a bit of history about The Atlantic magazine. The Atlantic was founded in 1857 in Boston, Massachusetts as The Atlantic Monthly by publisher Moses Dresser Phillips in association with prominent writers of the time, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Its first issue, published in November 1857, included a mission statement explaining the magazine's goals in the area of literature, arts, and politics. While the first two are fairly anodyne, the third is worth reading in full, as it reveals that a kind of reaching across the aisle style of centrism and unflinching U.S. patriotism have been at the magazine's core since its inception. The excerpt reads as follows, quote, "In politics, the Atlantic will be the organ of no party or clique, but will honestly endeavor to be the exponent of what its conductors believe to be the American idea. It will deal frankly with persons and with parties, endeavoring always to keep in view that moral element which transcends all persons and parties, and which alone makes the basis of a true and lasting national prosperity. It will not rank itself with any sect of antis, but with that body of men which is in favor of freedom, capital F, national progress, capital N, capital P, and honor, capital H, whether public or private," end quote.
In its often romantic and wistful reflections of its own history, the Atlantic magazine credits itself with being founded by abolitionists, which is partly true, or at least abolitionist sympathizers. Yet it kind of routinely undermines this by also reaffirming its commitment to quote-unquote American ideals, whatever that means. I guess slavery wasn't an American ideal. For example, a 1994 presentation by Colin Murphy, the magazine's managing editor, at the time echoed its kind of vaguely anti-political mission statement of 1857, writing, quote, "Among educated people throughout the United States, the issue of slavery was obviously of great moment, but so too was another matter. And in the boldest terms, it might be said to have involved an attempt to define and create a distinctly American voice, to project an American stance, to promote something that might be called an American ideal." He would go on to state, "Few places remain where scientists, politicians, business people, and writers, where members of the military, the clergy, and academia, where Republicans and Democrats, black and whites, the believer and the unbeliever can regularly hear one another speak. The Atlantic Monthly is one of those places," unquote. So the general idea is the Atlantic Monthly is the sort of definition of the center. It is a place where the right and the left can get together, Republican, Democrat, and there's this kind of romantic, shared, patriotic ideal of free exchanges of ideas. This is kind of central to their kind of fart-sniffing worldview.
The marketplace of ideas, Adam.
Throughout the rest of the 19th century, the magazine would publish pieces asking thought-provoking questions such as, what would happen if America fails to become a maritime power? And, quote, what unanticipated effects will the expanding thing called leisure time have on the American psyche, unquote. Jumping ahead, we're going to talk about the 80s and 90s a little bit, because this is really where they kind of enter their peak centrist ideological orientation, which is, since 1938, the Atlantic had been majority owned by a ranching family. But in 1980, real estate developer Mort Zuckerman, who also for a very long time owned the fourth largest newspaper in America, the New York Daily News, was known to hobnob with Presidents Reagan and Clinton. He funded both Democrats and Republicans, and he fancied himself a journalist and an editor. He didn't just become the new owner, he was also the chairman and was on the editorial board, thus explicitly exercising creative control and editorial control over the publication itself. And this is someone who made his money in real estate. The Boston Globe reported that same year in 1980 that Zuckerman planned to hire Richard Nixon as a contributor. Zuckerman's portfolio would include the following, where he wrote an article about the scandal of part-time America. This is from July 2014 for the Wall Street Journal, where he complains that Americans aren't working long enough, which he says the full-time scandal of part-time America, which he says, quote, fewer than half of U.S. adults are working full-time. Why? Slow growth and perverse incentives of Obamacare, where he blames the ACA for making America's lazy. Now, one thing that Zuckerman did that's relevant to in the interest of this podcast, which is a magazine cover we've actually discussed several years ago, which is the Atlantic magazine was a huge, huge promoter and was actually the first promoter of the broken windows theory. Now, you got to keep in mind, Zuckerman made all of his money off real estate, and broken windows is a policy largely born out of real estate interest, which is to say you over-police and hyper-criminalize petty and small-time behavior ostensibly to stop bigger crime, but really it's because you don't want graffiti and broken windows, because this is a man who quite literally owns tens of thousands of windows.
Yeah, so the Atlantic really is where the broken windows policy was first promoted to liberal elites, right? The intellectual class of American society. This was the March 1982 issue. The article by James Q. Wilson and George L. Kelling headlined "The Police and Neighborhood Safety." And this article, the Broken Windows article, is now kind of legendary, right? Infamous, I would argue, at least if you're listening to Citations Needed, certainly infamous, as it really did promote this idea to liberal elite intellectual circles in this country of it being really important to crack down on the petty crimes, to keep our society together, right? To deter worse crimes, right? Keep your neighborhoods nice and tidy. Make the cities look like the suburbs. This kind of idea and the violence and over-policing and then mass incarceration that it wrought cannot be overstated. We have done many, many episodes referencing these policies, and they were really born out of this initial salvo issued through the Atlantic magazine in 1982.
Because, and in case it's not clear, the thing the Atlantic magazine does and the function it serves, and we'll get into this more later, is it launders right-wing ideas to liberals, which is an important fulcrum for pushing right-wing ideas as being something that's science-driven, normal, good for squishy liberals. Because this is, again, if I'm someone who wants to push right-wing ideas, you can preach to the choir on AM radio and Fox News all day, and that has value, and people fund that. Obviously, Ben Shapiro's of the world. But selling right-wing ideas that are not necessarily right-wing on their face to liberals, this also helps create dispositive changes in policy, sort of like how you had to sell the Iraq War to the New York Times and the New Yorker magazine, right? Because you have to have some liberal buy-in.
If it was only promoted by obvious warmongers, it wouldn't then be called bipartisan. It wouldn't then be called moral. It then, would not have been laundered through those channels. It just would have been kind of imperialism. But this way, it sounds like intellectual freedom bringing.
Pushing broken windows in the National Review is not going to get you very far. Pushing broken windows in the New Republic and the Atlantic gets you very far. That's also, obviously, this is a function largely of the New Republic, especially in the 90s. And so Zuckerman sold the Atlantic magazine in 1999 to David Bradley, founder of the Corporate Executive Board Company, a consultancy firm, a great generic corporate name. According to the Washington Post, Bradley made $142 million when the company went public and used some of that money to buy the Atlantic. One of Bradley's first moves was to hire journalist and centrist hawk Michael Kelly as an editor. In 1995, Kelly coined the term fusion paranoia to refer to supposed convergence of the conspiracy-minded members of the political right and left. And in 2002, he wrote a piece for the Jewish World Review headlined "Anti-War Efforts Pervert Liberal Values," unquote, regarding opposition to the war in Iraq, in which he posed the question, wouldn't the freeing of the Iraqi people, like the freeing of the Afghan people, be a great moral victory? And it's worth mentioning that much like the New York Times and the New Republic, that the Atlantic magazine was central to selling the Iraq War to skeptical liberals and centrists. They had pro-Iraq War voices writing for them: Michael Kelly, Robert Kaplan, AEI fellow William Schneider, and Brookings rent-a-hacks like Stuart Taylor Jr. and Jonathan Rauch. These guys wrote a number of articles pushing the Iraq War in the Atlantic magazine in 2002 and 2003. And so they, again, were part of that effort, along with the New York Times, TNR, and others, The Economist magazine, to kind of sell the Iraq War as not a right-wing thing, but a kind of respectable bipartisan centrist policy.
So under David Bradley's ownership, by 2005, the Atlantic magazine launched the Davos-inspired, thought leader-laden Aspen Ideas Festival. The festival was named after its partner in the effort, the Aspen Institute, a Gates, Ford, and Carnegie, and other foundation-funded think tank. Speakers at the festival have included folks like Sam Harris, Mark Zuckerberg, Barry Weiss, J.D. Vance, Jordan Peterson, the Walton family, and many, many others. Some definitely not as ghoulish. We pick some bad ones, but occasionally some token labor leaders, of course, and poets might be thrown in. But when a ticket to the entire festival has a 5-digit price tag, it's fairly obvious who the audience really is. Now, back to the Atlantic itself. One of David Bradley's highest profile moves would be to hire Jeffrey Goldberg, currently the magazine's editor-in-chief. Now, Goldberg, a native of New Jersey who decided to join the Israeli military and voluntarily became a prison guard in occupied Palestine, was recruited from the New Yorker magazine, another elite American institution where he peddled one of the most consequential and destructive conspiracy theories of the last generation. That Iraqi President Saddam Hussein was behind the 9/11 attacks and had, in Goldberg's writing, quote, possible ties to Al-Qaeda, end quote. But to the Bradley-helmed Atlantic magazine, Goldberg was a hot commodity. The magazine just had to have him. Bradley hired Goldberg in 2007 after more than 2 years of bribing him to join the staff with things like hefty signing bonuses and ponies for his kids, literally, according to an August 2007 Washington Post story. Goldberg would spend his early years at the magazine primarily cheering on U.S. militarism, defending his beloved state of Israel, and fear-mongering about big bad Iran, penning such pieces as the attention-grabbing September 2010 cover story, quote, "The Point of No Return," end quote. Effectively a report straight from the mouths of the Israeli military intelligence establishment in an effort to force the Obama administration to launch a military attack on Iran. Goldberg wrote that according to Israeli intelligence estimates, quote, Iran is, at most, 1 to 3 years away from having a breakout nuclear capability, often understood to be the capacity to assemble more than one missile-ready nuclear device within about 3 months of deciding to do so, end quote. This was horseshit, and remained so. Goldberg also quoted a, quote, Israeli policymaker, end quote, as claiming Iran would have a nuclear weapon, quote, 9 months from June. In other words, March of 2011, end quote. Now, it should be noted that the following year, in June of 2011, Goldberg wrote a piece in Bloomberg entitled, quote, Iran wants the bomb and it's well on its way, end quote. And in this piece, Goldberg wrote, quote, it would take Iran anywhere from 6 months to a year after expelling the inspectors to enrich uranium to bomb strength. And in this period, it's almost guaranteed that Israel or the U.S. would bomb its nuclear facilities, end quote. He added, quote, various Western intelligence agencies and independent analysts think that the Iranians already possess enough low-enriched uranium to produce 2 or 3 bombs, end quote. He was insistent that his nuclear alarmism, again, total horseshit, was, quote, a reality-based worry, end quote, based on his characterization of Iranian leaders as, quote, bloody-minded mullahs bent on dominating the Middle East, end quote.
So yeah, Goldberg would spend the better part of 2011 and 2012 running pro-bombing of Iran flags up the pole to see if anyone would salute it, laundering fear-mongering by the Israeli government, Israeli military, which of course they ended up not bombing Iran because they were kind of just, it was a trial balloon. This is consistent with his Hezbollah sleeper cells in America story from 2002, and of course Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda working together from 2002 and 2003. It's a lot of pro-war fear-mongering for, like, again, part of putting it in this kind of prestige format next to a bunch of poems and well-written movie reviews kind of gives it some gravitas. You can't just dismiss it as right-wing fear-mongering. That's ultimately why this stuff's important and impactful. In 2014, the magazine would hire David Frum as its senior editor. Frum, of course, is best known as George W. Bush's speechwriter who coined the term axis of evil. In 2014, he had to write an apology in the Atlantic magazine, incidentally, that same year, for claiming that Palestinians were using crisis actors in their pictures when Israel bombed Gaza in 2014. He accused the AP and the New York Times of using fake photos, Palestinian actors with fake blood. That ended up not being true. Similarly, the Atlantic has become a kind of retirement community for washed up neocons, and Applebaum, Elliot Cohen, David Frum, pretty much anyone who supported the Iraq War who was not discredited. They were, much like Jeffrey Goldberg, given promotions to high status, high paid, well paid elite positions in the Atlantic to pontificate on other threats that may or may not be emerging. And most recently, of course, to smear Palestinians as people who lie about being bombed. Cut to 2017, David Bradley sells his majority stake in the magazine to the Emerson Collective, the Palo Alto-based, quote-unquote, philanthropic LLC, founded by Laurene Powell Jobs, the late Steve Jobs' widow. The company is named after Ralph Waldo Emerson, again, one of the Atlantic's founders. Because it's an LLC, Emerson Collective is legally permitted to invest in for-profit companies, lobby, and make political donations. So The investment firm takes full advantage of its ability to do so. It donated to former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel and former Governor Terry McAuliffe, two centrist Clintonites, and invested in multiple ed tech companies. Powell Jobs herself has given money to pro-charter school politicians, as every billionaire does. They all donate to pro-charter schools, which, if you've listened to the show, throw back to episode 1. This is kind of their MO. In a 2016 New York Magazine glowing profile of Powell Jobs, they wrote, quote, Powell Jobs joined the boards of Teach for All, an umbrella organization of the Teach for America and the New Schools Venture Fund, which sought in different ways to, quote, disrupt school districts and loosen the hold of teachers' unions on public schools, unquote. If you listen to episode 1, you know Teach for America is a scab organization funded by the Walton family. The Emerson Collective doesn't disclose all of its investments, although in a 2017 interview with Education Week, Ruslan Ali, one of Emerson's executives and former Obama administration assistant secretary, said that she was, quote, not prepared to answer, unquote, the question as to whether Emerson would commit to publicly disclosing its political contributions and investments in education-related candidates, causes, and companies. But the Emerson Collective and Lorraine Powell Jobs didn't have to do much to exert influence over the publication, which of course was already ideologically fairly center and right wing, but they have, of course, doubled down on their anti-teachers unions content, their pro-charter school content. In 2018, they launched the Speech Wars vertical, which was funded in part by the Koch Institute, that was supposedly consistent with their pedigree of being pro-free speech. This has since shut down. It's not exactly clear when, but they received a few $1 million to fund journalism and commentary about the threats of free speech, a task taken on most notably by Connor Friedersdorf, who's kind of the resident guy who complains about Oberlin undergrads. This was supercharged during this Koch-funded initiative to gripe about free speech on campus. They repeatedly wrote about cancel culture and sort of that type of thing, part of that elite meltdown, which was both ideological and due to their Koch industry funding, because since that is a huge hobby horse of the Koch Institute. And then they sort of pivoted in around 2017 as well into this arbiter of what is and what wasn't a conspiracy theory. In 2017, editor Kurt Anderson wrote a pretty thin, largely speculative and anecdotal 12,000-word cover story about how America had lost its mind. In the article, he laments the rise of conspiracy theories. Now, much of which is, again, perfectly fine and not true. Things like reptile people, things of that nature. But within this, he lumped other conspiracies. A few years later in 2020, they ran a publication called I Was a Teenage Conspiracy Theorist, which we discussed in episode 180, Havana Syndrome and the Power of Mainstream Acceptable Conspiracy Theories, which we noted that this was written by Atlantic editor Ellen Cushing, who lumped all quote-unquote conspiracyism together. So she included Illuminati, Pizzagate, and MKUltra, even though MKUltra is real and well documented. It also pathologized conspiracyism and flattened it as primarily a psychological phenomenon rather than one promoted by moneyed interest. Later, The Atlantic would go on to produce Shadowland, a documentary for NBC and Peacock that was produced by Jeffrey Goldberg that dealt with the rise of conspiracy theories. And of course, nowhere in any of this do they mention that one of the biggest, maybe even the most consequential conspiracy theory of the last 20 years, which is to say Saddam Hussein was working with Al-Qaeda, that Jeffrey Goldberg promoted, was mysteriously left off.
That's right. The producer of the conspiracy doc.
Right. And also, again, had articles about how Iran was a year away from having a nuclear weapon and how Israel was about to bomb Iran and how there were Hezbollah sleeper cells waiting to pounce in 2002, some of which could be construed as a conspiracy. I think it's fair to say. I think it's conspiracy theory by definition. And then, of course, the conspiracy theory to end all conspiracy theories, which is Saddam Hussein both is pursuing and has nukes, but also is working with Al-Qaeda, ended up not being true at all. Something Jeffrey Goldberg has never really addressed. He's kind of cheekily referenced it here and there.
Well, his career has not suffered for it, so.
No, Jeffrey Goldberg is one of the biggest promoters of conspiracy theories in media, certainly the most profound conspiracy theory in terms of impacting, he was on NPR in February of 2003, a month before the war, talking about how Saddam Hussein had quote unquote possible links to Al-Qaeda. He is now the arbiter of what is and what is a conspiracy theory. And this is kind of the ideological function of places like the Atlantic, is they determine what is and what isn't true. And if you have conspiracies that confirm to those in power, in his case, the George W. Bush administration, then that's not a conspiracy. That's just it is, right, definitionally. But it's not one that's sort of icky and dirty, like those far left-wing conspiracies. It's completely okay because it's about an official state enemy. So you can kind of make up whatever you want, despite how thinly sourced and how evidence-free the whole thing was. And this is kind of the function of why running these magazines is useful, because it has the official stamp of approval, and it doesn't sort of matter how dubious it is.
To discuss this more, we're now going to be joined by friend of the show, writer and analyst John Schwartz. John will join us in just a moment. Stay with us. We are joined now by John Schwartz, friend of the pod. He was a longtime senior editor at The Intercept and has been described before on this show as Citations Needed's chief David Frum correspondent, which I believe remains an important title considering the topic of this episode. John, welcome back to Citations Needed. It's great to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be talking to you guys.
Yeah, so this is a fairly big topic, but one I know you've been thinking and writing about for some time, because it falls squarely within your charge and our charge, which is that of the Atlantic magazine and its ideological function within the broader U.S. media sphere. Now, it's changed owners throughout the years, as we discussed at the top of the show, but has largely stayed consistent in its general tone and ideological disposition. Like other outlets that we've done episodes on, the New York Times, The Economist, The Atlantic prides itself on its kind of upwardly mobile, wealthy, insidery commentary and reporting. It's sort of seen as a magazine by the elites for the elites. And we argue that this serves a key function, as a lot of these kind of fulcrum publications do, or maybe we could call them even pivot publications, of selling right-wing ideas to liberals. It's kind of their main function, rather than the other way around, right? Rather than sort of selling liberalism to right-wingers, because right-wingers don't give a shit what the Atlantic has to say. And I want to sort of talk about this general ethos, whether it be austerity, war, which we'll talk about more later, promoting charter schools, promoting privatization of Social Security, promoting broken windows, where the Atlantic kind of falls within that broader milieu of making liberals, nod their head and go, yeah, maybe that idea from the American Enterprise Institute isn't so bad.
Yeah, well, I think that something that is now sort of part of a lost world of past American culture, people listening now may not really realize this, but it was a big deal when I was a youthful writer, was that there was a kind of hierarchy of prestige at the top of the publishing world in America. And at the tippy top was and is the New Yorker, fanciest magazine in America. But there were two others that were close behind the New Yorker, and number 2 was the Atlantic, and number 3 was Harper's. And again, hard to remember, even if you lived through it, pretty much vanished from the consciousness of anybody under 40 at this point. But all of that mattered a lot in America's intellectual life. And the Atlantic remains, one of the most prestigious publications in America today, and absolutely is a conveyor belt for awful right-wing ideas to nice, polite, well-educated, well-meaning, wealthy liberals. And this has been true for a long, long time. The Atlantic started out as somewhat different from what it is now. Like, it was a super duper New England-y, waspy, abolitionist publication when it started. And that brand of liberalism in the United States, if you think of John Quincy Adams, I don't know how much people listening to this program pay attention to the lives
Who doesn't?
Times. Yeah, who doesn't? John Quincy Adams, one-term president who then returned to the House of Representatives after he was kicked out of office. That was a particular brand, a particular flavor of liberalism that has vanished from the U.S. landscape now. I would say preferable to the liberalism we have now, but in any case, it then morphed later on into what it is today. And there's a super interesting example of that they published in 1949 that you can find on the Atlantic website today. The headline is Israel, Young Blood and Old, and it's by someone named George Biddle. And that's significant because Biddle was from this, famous waspy New England-y family, the Biddles. He was friends with FDR, and he traveled to Israel right after the 1948 war to report for the Atlantic. And you can actually, in this article, in real time, see Jewish Israelis being promoted in the minds of WASPs to being white people. So this is from Israel, Young Blood and Old in the Atlantic. And he describes the citizens of this new state of Israel and describes them as possessing youth, a high proportion of physical beauty, health, vitality, politeness, good nature. And then he says, one sees comparatively few marked Semitic types and fewer still of the East Side bearded, skull-capped, moth-eaten, grease-spotted, parchment-dry rabbis.
Wow. He's promoting them to white. Just to be clear, they're not Arabs, right? They're white adjacent.
Yeah, they are now white adjacent. So the Jewish Israelis have been promoted to white. The Arabs have now been demoted. And it's clear that all of this is in the surface of the fact that he says this country is going to be able to serve U.S. interests. That's why one group is being promoted and one group is being demoted. The Arabs, he describes as foul, diseased, smelling, rotting, and pullulating with vermin and corruption.
Wow.
Slinking about the streets, flat-footed, with loose, dribbling lower lips.
Jesus.
Carrying with them sacks of refuse.
That's pretty that's pretty racist even for 1949.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. And as I say, this was the mass wasp overmind of 1949, being like, this new country, they're going to be able to do stuff in the Mideast that we want done. And now they're beautiful. Look at them.
Exactly. The bulwark against barbarism.
Precisely.
That was, promoted by Herzl.
A theme that they still write today, which we'll get into.
Well, indeed. Well, this actually gets to our next question, John. This idea of how the Atlantic serves American imperialism, kind of neo-colonialism, foreign interests, right? Like the way that we understand foreign affairs in this country and how our government pursues it, who is on the inside, who is obviously on the outside, and what that means to be on the outside at the other end of whether it's a bayonet or an M16 or a gigantic missile. And so, as we've discussed with you before, the Atlantic remains kind of a retirement home for discredited Iraq war boosting neocons. I mean, from Anne Applebaum to David Frum, Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief now, and former IDF prison guard, Elliot Cohen as well. And the Atlantic itself was, as we've also discussed with you, central to selling the invasion of Iraq in 2002, 2003, publishing article after article promoting the invasion, namely by such luminary experts as Michael Kelly, Robert Kaplan, American Enterprise Institute fellow William Schneider, and Brookings rent-a-hacks like Stuart Taylor Jr. and Jonathan Rauch. So this kind of like parking lot of washed-up neocons still remains very much part of the bread and butter of like the pages of the Atlantic right today, pushing Biden, recently to bomb Iran, or as we keep reading, to inflict even greater slaughter upon Gaza. John, can you talk, if you will, about the genre of like highbrow warmonger imperialist and how the Atlantic has long defined this particular genre of socially acceptable sociopathy?
Yeah, the thing that is so fascinating to me about this, and the thing that is so difficult for me to come to terms with about this, is that I grew up like essentially in the Atlantic's headquarters in Bethesda, Maryland, which is just outside of Washington, D.C. And like Atlantic writers were thick on the ground. Atlantic writers were well respected among the people that I knew growing up.
Pick an Applebaum from the tree.
Exactly. Go out into the yard, feel the sun on your skin, and pick an Applebaum, as many as you wished. And once I broke out of that mindset, in retrospect, it is absolutely horrifying. And when you look at their career trajectories, you see what this job actually is. So one of them, as you mentioned now, is David Frum. David Frum, listeners of this show probably know, was a speechwriter for the George W. Bush administration. He is the person who coined the famous axis of evil phrase that was used in the State of the Union address, I believe, in 2002, that sort of set the stage for the coming invasion of Iraq in 2003. Then Jeffrey Goldberg, of course, was one of the leading propagandists. So like John McCain entered his articles into the congressional record saying, like, here's why we must fight Saddam. And there's a wonderful example of this, Jeffrey Goldberg in, I think, October of 2002, where Slate was debating the war to be. And one of Jeffrey Goldberg's contributions to this debate was, he said, there's not sufficient space for me to refute some of the arguments made in Slate over the past week against the war, which is like there's just not enough room on the internet. Like, God damn it, if there were enough room, then you better believe that I would crush these people in intellectual debate. But unfortunately, there's just not. But he goes on to say, The administration is planning today to launch what many people would undoubtedly call a short-sighted and inexcusable act of aggression. In 5 years, however, I believe that the coming invasion of Iraq will be remembered as an act of profound morality.
Mm-hmm.
And so October 3rd, 2002, I read that and I was like, I'm setting my clock by this. Let's look back at this on October 3rd, 2007 and find out about this profound act of morality. But anyway, the point is, David Frum, Jeffrey Goldberg, a lot of these other people, makes you understand what their job actually is. So the naive might believe that the job of journalists is to try to find out the truth and tell other people about the truth. And if that were the case, obviously their careers would have been ended by their catastrophically wrong statements and claims before the war. So that would be if that were their job, to find out the truth. If their job was to start wars, then obviously they would be promoted, and we know what happened. And so that tells us a lot about what their jobs actually are. And, David Frum is still there. Jeffrey Goldberg was rewarded for his catastrophic propaganda. And that's the story. That's where we are today. And they will never stop. They will never give it up on Iraq specifically. I wrote an article for the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, so last year, because David Frum had written an article in the Atlantic where he referred to the U.S. finding an arsenal of chemical warfare shells and warheads in Iraq. Now, again, that was a long time ago now. That was 20 years ago. But I hope people remember that that never happened, that Iraq did not possess weapons of mass destruction. And you don't need to know anything about this issue to understand that. Like, on its face, it's preposterous, because you may remember the whole purported reason for the war was Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. David Frum is saying that they were found, but have you ever heard George Bush or Dick Cheney say anything about this arsenal?
No.
Like, you might think that even that they were totally vindicated by the location of this arsenal in Iraq and Saddam Hussein's nefarious plans, that they would have mentioned it, but they did not, because that didn't happen and the arsenal did not exist. And I wrote to the PR vice president of the Atlantic and was like, hey, by the way, what is the evidence for this? And also, I just talked to Charles Dulfer, who ran the CIA's program, to try to find out what the story was with Saddam's WMD programs. Did this in 2003, 2004. And he says, you're wrong. And nonetheless, the Atlantic 100% stood behind it and refused to correct anything about it. So they were right. The CIA was wrong. Dick Cheney, George W. Bush were wrong. The Atlantic knows what they're talking about. Case closed.
Yeah. So speaking of that, because that's a good segue into our next question, which is about their newfound position, self-appointed position as arbiter of the conspiracy theories. So they kind of jumped on the post-2016 anti-fake news, anti-conspiracy bandwagon. Jeffrey Goldberg had a front page article about the rise of conspiracy and Conspiracy America, which we discussed at the top of the show. They had a series on Peacock about conspiracyism. Now, some of them were kind of just QAnon and the like. But the irony of Jeffrey Goldberg, as we discussed, determining what is and what isn't a conspiracy is pretty extraordinary for anyone, like you said, who pays attention to his central role in selling what was probably the single most consequential conspiracy theory of at least my generation, which was the idea that Saddam Hussein was involved in the 9/11 attacks, that he had ties to, significant ties to Al-Qaeda. When he was writing for The New Yorker, Jeffrey Goldberg painted a fairly elaborate conspiracy about shady Al-Qaeda members being housed in Iraq, meeting with Saddam Hussein, in the northern deserts in these kind of clandestine operations. He painted a fairly elaborate picture, none of which has ever been verified by any other reporter. Never been followed up on. No one's backed up any of those claims. They kind of just drifted away and they got memory hold. Again, this was mainstream reporting. He went on NPR, as we've discussed on the show before, and discussed his alleged findings, his alleged reporting, showing these not just tenuous links, but direct links, direct contacts between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. This was, of course, the way you linked the trauma of 9/11 to the Iraqi government to justify the war in Iraq. Now he's saying, I'm going to determine what is and what isn't a conspiracy. And I'm not only going to do that, I'm going to have a show on Peacock Network where we talk about that. So talk about this kind of role as a gatekeeper of kind of acceptable opinion, and why there's some conspiracies that are considered vulgar and inappropriate, and some conspiracies that you can promote and just kind of move on with your life and no one ever talks about it ever again.
And endorsed at the highest level of American intellectual thought and publication.
And I should note, he also published quite a bit of conspiracies about Iran and their nuclear program, and Iran wanting to attack Israel in 2009, 2010 as well. So this is sort of not a one-off thing. He did this for quite a while when he was at least ostensibly a reporter.
That's right. And that is a key thing to understand about the liberal milieu, like the liberal intellectual world. This is a key difference between the liberal intellectual world and the conservative intellectual world, both of which are teeming with conspiracy theories of just an extraordinary, incredibly colorful and delightful to investigate if you're into the weird ways the human brain operates. What usually happens is that the conspiracy theories in the liberal world can be differentiated from the conservative ones in the sense that the liberal ones are generally things that are not true, but could possibly be true in this universe. So Saddam Hussein collaborating with Osama bin Laden, like on its face, a bizarre idea that almost certainly would not happen. But it's not like physically impossible.
Right.
Like human beings could actually execute this conspiracy. Whereas the right-wing conspiracies now are, there's an old lady who lives in a hut in the woods and she is stealing our children and vivisecting them to drink their adrenochrome.
Right. Not likely.
Yeah, which is actually, impossible and has never happened.
Slightly less possible.
Yeah. And so that is what makes Jeffrey Goldberg so skilled as a propagandist, is that he would never come within a million miles. And as you say, actually attacks the conservative, bizarro world conspiracy theories, all in the service of selling his own more plausible but still completely wrong conspiracy theories. And it is galling for people like ourselves with our feet firmly planted in reality as they are. And we never make any mistakes on this subject. But it's absolutely incredible to see. And I agree with you. It's like here's the conspiracy theorist telling us about conspiracy theories.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, I think it really has to do with, as we've been saying on the show, and also you've been pointing out, John, this idea of what is allowed and what is not only allowed, but what is authorized as being kind of the highest level of intellectual thought, using that and then laundering it through the reputation, the kind of highfalutin reputation of a magazine like The Atlantic. It's almost like the magazine equivalent of the argument like, well, Abe Lincoln was a Republican, and so Republicans are clearly for freedom, right? Like The Atlantic started as an abolitionist magazine, so therefore The Atlantic has an intellectual acumen and history that is unimpeachable, and so therefore time does not evolve, right? Time doesn't move on, things don't change. You got to have like one kind of identity, one criteria, and then you get to maintain that kind of status in the way that you propagandize yourself. And I think the one way that this has also happened is The Atlantic's obsession with so-called cancel culture, and namely the unruliness of college kids, right? Like campuses are getting out of hand. It is really a kind of consistent and intense focus of theirs. In 2018, The Atlantic partnered with none other than the Charles Koch Foundation to launch its quote-unquote Speech Wars project, that, in its own words, was, quote, born out of The Atlantic's legacy of covering threats to free expression, freedom, and justice, beginning with the magazine's founding in 1857 as a nonpartisan journal that argued for the cause of abolition, and more urgently, by the public's increasing sectarianism and declining tolerance for challenging points of view, end quote. Now, the most prominent pontificator of these allegedly sectarian scolds is Connor Friedersdorf. Now, let's talk, if you would, about this kind of ruling class's obsession with this cancel culture topic, the idea of, we have to hear views that challenge our sensibilities, which, I mean, of course, on its own is not a terrible idea. That's actually great. That actually happens a lot, especially on college campuses. But what about this version of cancel culture, pearl clutching, do you think is so central to The Atlantic's overall editorial mission?
This entire thing, this entire focus on college campuses and their hatred of free speech and so forth, is a focus that was encouraged and described as a project for the future in the famous Lewis Powell memo of 1971. Like, people listening to the show are exactly the kind of weirdos and oddballs who will know what I'm talking about. Just before Lewis Powell was put on the Supreme Court by Nixon, he was a tobacco lawyer for the most part, like the absolute worst kind of corporate lawyer you can imagine. And he wrote this memo for the Chamber of Commerce about how, the right is being decimated and here's how we have to fight back. And this strategy was, put into action over the last 50 years, and they really have won. Like, they really succeeded. They put in the time and effort, and they did it. And one of the things that he was talking about was free speech is being crushed on college campuses. So it's a real obsession of theirs. And I think that the explanation for it is pretty straightforward. I'm sure you've seen about, like, both the billionaire hedge fund guy, private equity, Bill Ackman, and how he was converted to the cause of anti-wokeness because his daughter went to Harvard and became a Marxist. And Elon Musk, also has been outraged by the fancy private school education one of his kids got in Los Angeles and turned his child against him. And so
those aren't the challenging ideas that they want to see, right?
That we need to expose people to. Absolutely not.
Right.
They bewitch our youth. And so we've got to stop that from happening.
The most challenging idea we can hear is just more like anti-communism.
Exactly. Like what I'm thinking of here that we need more of on college campus is like the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal.
That's what we need.
And possibly the op-ed page of like Investor Business Daily, which people may know is like the Wall Street Journal, except absolutely
mad money.
Yes, out of their minds. And so this is a subject that strikes like right at the heart of America's ruling class. Their children are being indoctrinated with the wrong ideas, and so they want to go ahead and prevent that from ever happening. So their children don't come home at Christmas and start lecturing them about the proletariat. But like the fact is, in America, 95% of cancel culture, political correctness, whatever you want to say about this, is from the right. And it is so powerful and so omnipresent that people don't even think of it using those words. There is a real problem with the squelching of free speech in the United States. It's just that most of it comes from the right. And it makes sense that for a magazine like The Atlantic, that they would endlessly dither about the much smaller, much less consequential kind of political correctness that you see from the purported left.
It's definitely a sort of ruling class neurosis. You see this with people like Connor Friedersdorf. His entire beat, for the most part, is to whine about college campus sort of free speech. And insofar that he actually becomes kind of very defensive about it, and even has a post say from 2019 saying, why I cover college controversies. Should a journalist care about free speech wars in the era of Donald Trump? And it's like, there's a whole vertical dedicated to that at The Atlantic. It's central to The Atlantic. I did a report for my Substack about there was a heat wave in Texas that killed several people who were stuck in prisons without air conditioning. And basically nobody covered it. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to take the same time frame, which was a month. I'm going to see how many people covered college campus controversies, which killed 0 people. The Atlantic had 8 different stories about cancel culture in that time frame. The Washington Post, New York Times said, I think 12, and I'm going to say 7, respectively. And so it's like, if I was an alien reading publications or intercepting our news coverage from cable, from, Andromeda or whatever, I would think that this was one of the most urgent things going on in this world. And of course, we see in many ways why that is with the destruction of Gaza, where it's like the central, what is seen as kind of ground zero as any kind of opposition to these types of things is from colleges. So it is both a disproportionate neurosis from the ruling class, but also there's a logic to it. Because if you're worried about what people think 5, 10 years, 20 years from now, you want the kind of Koch brothers vision of colleges, which is basically just their fucking vocational schools, their training schools for people to learn how to make widgets, but not to think about anything. Well, the rich can think about things, but the poor aren't supposed to think about things, right? The rich can major in philosophy and Latin and study those types of things, but the poor really just should be widget makers or pushers of widgets. Peddlers of widgets. And this obsession with this idea of like uppity college kids is all over The Atlantic. It is because, again, I think it reflects the elite consensus and also the kind of ideological disposition of those in charge and those who fund it. And it is definitely seems to be out of proportion with what the actual things that are actually important. And I think it's like, you really can't run an elite publication like the New York Times or The Atlantic without having 75 different stories about college campus neurosis. It is like the thing they get mad at. And now, again, I think that you're right. To some extent, it becomes personal because their own kids are now coming back with nose rings and Marxism and lesbianism and all these scary things.
Yeah, like for one summer before they go intern for Goldman Sachs.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, John, so as someone who worked for 10 years at an outlet that was kind of outside of this New Yorker, New Republic, Atlantic, Harper's, that kind of level of what they would self-describe as like the most prestigious publications, as you've been saying, like how much of this do you see as also being like terrified to lose that higher ground or terrified to lose that kind of arbitration of intellect, of truth in this space? As, I mean, this is going to sound kind of like hokey and old manish. That's fine. I'm a hokey old man. But like the idea that, oh, well, the kids are getting their news from TikTok. And so no one's reading the Atlantic anymore. And so we have to, be anti-woke and we have to be pro-colonial and we have to talk about, things this way because that is still where our leaders are going to get their information. And we have to somehow discredit these other sources. What do you kind of see as like that kind of motivation in the pages of these types of magazines?
I think that is absolutely one of, if not the biggest motivation on their part. Because the thing about sort of the U.S. empire at this point is that its claims are so preposterous, are so contrary to what people can see with their own eyes. And like absolutely Gaza is a prime example of this. But then you had the invasion of Iraq, which is a cornerstone of my worldview, which was this towering edifice of lies. And as soon as it meets reality, it just collapses into dust. And what you are left with at that point, when, everything that you are advocating is obvious lies for anyone with eyes to see, is just screaming at people and trying to intimidate them intellectually. Because a lot of people, they don't spend their lives studying these issues. Like I was very lucky to have a job where I could do that. And so, I was confident enough to know that what the people were saying was preposterous and was nonsense. But most regular human beings, like they don't want to be yelled at when they haven't spent a lot of time studying these issues, and they don't like being told, that they're idiots and simps for Vladimir Putin. And so that's all they have left is these shrill, bizarre attacks on anyone who has a different worldview. And the thing that's funny to me about, The Intercept, we are seen as these horrendous barbarians, among these other publications, that we ourselves are out of their minds. When in fact, I'm a very nice, well-behaved man. Like I've always followed the rules. I send thank you notes.
Oh, I got to do that more often.
It's magical what it will do for your life. People really love thank you notes. And, I ask about how people's moms are doing. And so my political perspective is not very complicated. It's just like number one, I think it's a bad thing for the U.S. government to constantly lie about everything. And number two, I think it's bad for the U.S. government to just murder people all the time.
It seems like a fairly civilized take, but not civilized in the mind of the Atlantic.
Right.
Well, if America doesn't kill people, China and Russia will. So someone has to do the killing. It may as well be us.
Exactly. Like we have so much practice.
Yeah.
Do you want to be killed by America or like by these amateurs in China and Russia?
These unruly upstarts.
Well, yeah, John. I mean, I think this idea of who gets to speak for civilization, right? To kind of present it back to the readers, to endorse it, to analyze it specifically in the way that is deemed most in favor of maintaining a current power structure. I mean, I know that's kind of seems sort of obvious, but like this idea that the same publication can endorse broken windows policing and turn around and then endorse the invasion of Iraq and then, continue to endorse school privatization. Like there's a clear agenda here, and it doesn't seem to be the pursuit of challenging viewpoints or truth, as we keep saying, but actually this kind of maintenance of the social and political superstructure and just sort of getting that imprint of authority and of importance. I think, something Adam and I talk about a lot is this idea of seriousness. So before we let you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the kind of seriousness vibe of the Atlantic, why it takes itself so seriously, why it needs everyone else to consider it so, seriously in this space.
Yes. Well, this is a core part of the self-conception of anybody with power, which is that they are the serious, rational ones. And then the rest of us are these like irrational children who are out of our minds running around far below them on the planet, the surface of planet Earth. And they have this Olympian view from 40,000 feet. And in fact, John Adams, the father of John Quincy Adams, said something famously along these lines to Thomas Jefferson, where he talked about how, power always believes that, it can see far into the future and can see everything that's happening, when in fact it is only serving its own ends. It's really worth looking up and reading that, because he was right then, and he could perceive that then because the United States was not the most powerful country on earth yet. And so we were less powerful, and so he could see things from the perspective of people without power. Anyway, it is funny. It's just uniform. It's a uniform perspective of people with power, and there's nothing they hate more, in my experience, than making jokes about them. Because they have the money, they have the guns, but they do not have any jokes. And it drives them crazy. Like, they themselves are not funny people. They have no defense when you make a joke about them. And the commentary track to the movie Life of Brian, Michael Palin talks about this, and he says, I've always thought revolutionaries should use jokes more, because this is a very potent weapon that the people in charge cannot fight back against. And so that is The Atlantic. Now, I say they don't publish, I'll say personally, what drives me crazy is they don't publish humor pieces anymore. Like, I wrote a humor piece for them many, many years ago, and that is never going to happen again, because they have laid down the law. No more jokes.
That's right. They're not the New Yorker. They're even more serious than the New Yorker.
Exactly. Look how much more serious we are. We don't even have one page of jokes every week. Not in The Atlantic, my friend.
Clearly, John, the reason we had you as a guest today is because of the continuing grievance of that you don't get your own Talk of the Town section in The Atlantic. But that will do it for this interview. It has been so awesome to talk to you, John. John Schwartz, friend of Citations Needed, was a longtime senior writer at The Intercept, and as we have said time and time again, our leading David Frum, Jeffrey Goldberg, The Atlantic correspondent. John, always a pleasure to have you on Citations Needed.
Oh yeah, always great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, we didn't mention this at the top of the show, but I wrote an article 2 weeks into the Israeli bombing of Gaza for the Real News that talked about how The Atlantic wrote all these articles about the bombing of Gaza without really having any voices, Palestinian voices at all. In fact, for the first 2 weeks, they had 38 articles on the topic and only one token Palestinian, who was a former Palestinian Authority official who wrote this kind of dry analysis of the PA in the context of the war. So pretty much no real Palestinian voices. Meanwhile, of course, several Israelis, obviously nonstop Americans, most overwhelmingly pro-Israel. They have since, I think, had maybe a couple different token Palestinians, but more or less it's 90, 95% people who are not Palestinian talking about Palestine. And this is not because Jeffrey Goldberg, again, the guy was a prison guard for the IDF. I mean, he admits to covering up the torture of a prisoner in his 2006 memoir. He's pretty open about it. I guess if you sort of put a lampshade on it, it's okay. But this is someone who's going to have to sell the kind of centrist war consensus, very pro-Obama, very pro-Biden, very pro kind of centrist liberal reportage. Generally speaking, again, there are exceptions here and there. They'll have a sort of token dissenting voice to mix it up. It's not a one-party publication. It's not the sort of Gazette. But it is largely and overwhelmingly conservative and centrist in its outlook. And this is ultimately why you have all these, much like the New York Times and MSNBC, it's why all these washed up neoconservatives end up there, because they don't have any organic constituency among the right anymore. There'll be think tanks and even populate the Trump administration, but there's not a lot of populist people aren't clamoring, conservatives aren't clamoring anymore to read David Frum, right? It's MSNBC, more wealthy Democratic viewers. And that's really their kind of market. It's this overlap of effectively conservative Democratic voters.
Well, yeah, who also fancy themselves as kind of intellectuals getting the best, well-read, documented, sometimes data-driven, right? But really intellectual fare. And I don't want to be dismissive of that. I like things that are smart. I think smart people should write things and other people should read them. Sure, whatever, cool. But that's the whole vibe. It's more about the vibe of academia, of scholarship, of intellect that then launders right-wing ideology through this kind of elite institution, right? The elite writing of well-heeled smarties. And so therefore, the shitty ideas get peddled to liberals, and then right-wing ideas become liberal ideas. And then there's only like one broad intellectual consensus that just happens to be right-wing.
Well, and then he published straight up nasty racist screeds. So Elliot Cohen, who is a former Bush official and signatory to the Project for a New American Century, which is the think tank that basically was the architect of the Iraq War, as a spinoff of the American Enterprise Institute. A few days after the October 7th attack, he wrote, quote, in his article, Against Barbarism, he wrote, quote, Americans have spent the last 2 decades fighting, quote, barbarians in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, unquote. And matter-of-factly said that Israel's fight against Palestinians was, quote, a fight against barbarism. He would go on to say, barbarians fight because they enjoy violence. They do not only kill and maim. The armies of civilized states do it all the time, but go out of their way to inflict pain, to torture, to rape, and above all, humiliate. They exult in their enemies' suffering. That is why they like taking pictures of their weeping, terrified victims, why they make videos of slow beheadings, and why they dance around mutilated corpses, unquote. So you have this sort of very, again, explicitly Orientalist racist framing that the enemy is barbarians and we are out to fight barbarians. And so this is a sort of highbrow publication this stuff is published in.
Right. That's not like Fox News. That's not like some dark screed on 4chan. Like, that's in the Atlantic.
Right. And that gives it a veneer of credibility and official sort of sanction. And so, yeah, that's what that's the kind of stuff you're dealing with here.
Yeah, I think actually writer David Cleon summed it up really well when he wrote for the New Republic in October 2020 about a compendium of articles that was published by The Atlantic as a book, articles spanning a number of years of its coverage of American democracy. The publication is called The American Crisis, What Went Wrong, How We Recover. It's 500 pages, has like 40 articles written and published between 2016 and mid-2020. And in reviewing this, writer David Cleon wrote this about the magazine, quote, The Atlantic is a magazine not precisely of the center, but rather of a set of liberal civic ideas. More than any other publication, its purpose seems to be the continual renewal of educated Americans' commitment to high-mindedness, end quote. And so that kind of commitment to not only high-mindedness, but also to very conservative American ideals, right? Some of the most conservative, whether it's broken windows policing, whether it is the invasion and occupation of other countries, whether it is the scourge of wokeism on college campuses, all of these, when put through the Atlantic machine, come out as liberal ideas, liberal elite high-mindedness, and influence our politics in incredibly destructive ways. But that will do it for this episode of Citations Needed. Thank you, everyone, for listening and for supporting the show. Of course, you can follow the show on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook, Citations Needed, and become a supporter of the show through patreon.com/Citations Needed podcast. All your support through Patreon is so incredibly appreciated, as we are 100% listener funded. And as always, a very special shout out goes to our critic level supporters on Patreon. They include Brad Hayward, Zach Cathcart, Lorenzo Mitchell, Ben Lazar, Morgan Green Hopkins, Ed Zitron, Corporate Zombie, Eric Joyner, Buzz Among Us, Stinky Pete, DL Singfield, JM Geralt, Chris Vincent, Nigel Kirby, Scott Roth, Porter Schutz, Zachary Henson, Josh Durlam, Joe Wengert, Steely Dan Halen, Douglas, Danger Manley, Green New Neil, Trasdat, Brickshop Audio, Supple Old Man, David McMurray, MSP, William Rush, Garrett Geiser, Political Zombie, Extra Domum, Gwendolyn, Kyle, Heather Redacted, Kevin Bowman, Jason Eason, Chris Sarah, Dash X, James Michaela, Greg Westney, Drew Johnson, Max Belanger, David Bettner, Brendan O'Connor, Ultra Miraculous, Zappo, Sturm Wyvern, Darren Brady, Bart DeCourcy, Ra, Max Wilsey, Blake Bunell, Xenia Zadvornik, Tatiana Maslany, Tsukimi Yuki, Psychic Pizza, Panic Emoji, Brendan Hines, Doc Reitzel, Philip Moss, Rulo's Bar, Jameson Saltzman, A Very Throwable Brick, Bitcoin Wallet Inspector, Shock Fist, Weed Lord, AI Scare, Backups Care, and of course, Computer Scare. I am Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
Our senior producer is Florence Burrow Adams. Producer is Julianne Tweeten. Production assistant is Trina Lightburn. Newsletter by Marco Cardolano. Transcriptions are by Mahnor Imran. The music is by Grandaddy. Thanks again, everyone. We'll catch you next time.